Воно не буде рушитися.
Ну, постанову прийняли, жодне міністерство не прийшло.
Вони на нас виходять, ми їм стараємося допомагати. Тобто наш підхід такий. Ми, як ми бачимо? Ми бачимо дві організаційні одиниці. Перша організаційна одиниця – це технічні спеціалісти, які будуть всіх просто консультувати, допомагати, контролювати і так далі. Ми готові цих спеціалістів фултайм.
Я перепрошую, за хвилину почнемо.
Ну, коротше.
Далі не випускають.
Це таке. Вибач, це просто важко. Я не напроти.
Так.
It's December 14, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko. We start our day with the conversation with the following topic: how to create digital inclusion. The Ministry of Digital Transformation and partners are about to announce the results of their studies. Joining us in this studio are Tetyana Lomakina, advisor and commissioner of the President of Ukraine for the barrier-free environment, Mstislav Banik, head of the electronic services development at the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine, Volodymyr Brusilovskyi, head of the DIA support project, United Nations Development Program, and Dmytro Popov, UNDP expert on digital accessibility and author of both studies. Well, it's a little bit difficult to talk about digital accessibility and inclusivity in view of the problems with Kyivstar, but we hope that all those problems will be solved shortly. So, Ms. Tetyana, let's start this conversation with you. Can you please tell us how is the digital inclusion regulated in European Union and how do we integrate those practices in our legislation? Good morning, everybody. Well, Ukraine does not only study the European practices, but we've taken an important step on the way of implementation of the digital communications of Ukraine. There is a resolution by the Cabinet of Ministers that stipulates that the government authorities should switch to the digital communication standards existing in the European Union, and it is approved as a national standard now. So just like we usually do it, we keep asking, how can I use all those services with different types of impairments like sight impairment or hearing impairment? So it's just the first step, and ahead of us we have a lot of systemic work when we are about to recreate. We will recreate the new under the new standards, but everything that works now, we have to make it work in a way it's accessible and barrier-free. It requires a lot of financial investments and man hours that we will be working, but the fact that we switch to those standards is an important step. Again, during this war, we're like living in two realities. In one reality, we're modern and developed, and our DIA application is recognized all over the world. And on the other hand, we suffer damages every day, and those problems with Kyivstar cannot do anything but push us to the thought that, or prompt us to the thought that Probably everything is not so good, but we hope we will continue to receiving all the necessary digital services. Mr. Mstislav, can you please tell us about the way the Ministry of Digital Transformation implements the European practices, and maybe, as Ms. Tetyana mentioned, maybe there is some unique experience that we can share with the world, something developed by ourselves. Well, good morning, everybody. Let me start from the general things. We're talking about the barrier-free environment not for the first time, and in Ukraine, unfortunately, this area is only growing. We have a huge amount of civil population affected by the war. A lot of the military get injured, which results in sight and hearing impairment, and they require a lot of different solutions in the barrier-free area. And you know, the inclusivity is a huge puzzle. You cannot just take one element of this puzzle and say like, okay, we're done with the barrier-free environment issue. We have different studies for different solutions. Today we're talking about, or today we're about to share the results of the study about the legal regulation and legal practices existing in Europe. So all those are the small pieces of the puzzle that we should take into account talking about the barrier-free environment. So it's not a task similar to an electronic service like charging your place of residence online. It's not something that you can just have done and get away with it. It's a regular process. It's an ongoing process that we should continue working in, and I want to thank the UNDP for all this work in this area, because we were talking about the studies of the barrier-free environment in Ukraine, and now we're talking about the solutions for the people with the sight impairment and harmonization with the European Union law. That is not a matter, that is not a thing that is about to happen or not to happen. It's a requirement for our accession. But let's talk honestly, DIA is a flagman product, but we're not talking about just the delivery of services for different categories of population in different areas, but talking about accessibility. DIA has a very strong positions, but the results of the studies that we have, let's be honest, they demonstrate that we have a lot to continue working on. There is no syndrome of a good student, so to say, and the requirements to DIA are even higher because a huge number of people is using it. 19.8 million are using the mobile application. Meanwhile, we have 3.5 personal accounts created in the portal for acquisition of services. So this is the minimum number of people that can use DIA, and those solutions should be available for people who have those special needs. It's very good that we work on it, good that we work on it in the team, and we are about to harmonize it with the legislation of the European Union, because talking about the private sector, everything there works based on competition and on the requirements of the clients. And talking about the government sector, first of all, everything should be always based upon the regulations, because only they are the premises for modernization. It shouldn't be based only on a desire of a government official, but it should also contemplate some regulation the work is based upon. Thank you very much. Mr. Volodymyr, what are the best global practices that Ukraine should implement to make sure that web accessibility is on the highest level in Ukraine? Well, let me thoughts from United Nations Development Program. Basically, in Ukraine, there are three factors that make the movement in this area non-alternative. First is digitalization of our life. I'm not talking about the martial law. This latest time, but I mean, it's a global trend. Ukrainians study, work online, we buy things online. Everything or a lot of things that we do is related to online services and internet. And yet another area is digitalization of the government sector. Ukrainians support more transparent government, digital government, and the third area is the war. We have 3 million people with disabilities in Ukraine. Unfortunately, this number is growing. Our defenders keep getting injured. They get back to their civil lives with sight and hearing impairments, as well as other impairments and disabilities, and it doesn't give us any other alternative. We cannot allow a significant part of the population of Ukraine, because 3 million is a lot, is the huge figure. We cannot allow them to live without the future, without understanding of this digital future which is about to develop on and on. So I'm humbled by the fact that the colleagues from the government sector support us. Obviously Ukraine has other priorities now, but we cannot let ourselves just do nothing in this area. Just like my colleagues said about the integration to the European Union. In European Union, the requirements are quite strict for digital accessibility, and obviously Ukraine cannot allow it, cannot afford not complying with them. Ukraine has made very significant steps within the last couple of years. There are formal mandatory requirements for the executive government to use the same standard which is mandatory for the European Union members, including a large number of countries, and the same standard operates in other developed countries of the world like Japan, New Zealand, USA, Australia. Our organization made a fundamental study about the way it works, and some components of the study will be presented today. So talking about what is supposed to be done, like, yeah, we've done this and that, but what else? As we know, it's not always sufficient to adopt a legislation which says, like, do this. We understand that it requires implementation, control, it requires political pressure on those who are not willing to do so, not willing to comply. It requires the expansion of the legislation for the businesses, because if disabled people for example, cannot use or to buy the tickets for railway online, we cannot say that we have a developed society with no barriers. But I'm sure you can do it specifically in case of railway, Ukrzaliznytsia, but maybe in some other cases, you know. So we have to scale it up to all the sectors of the government, local government, and judicial authority. So we should institutionalize this process. The state is supposed to be able to do it by itself. We support it as UNDP, but we are at the phase when the state is supposed to acquire its competences, specialist teams, as well as energy and impetus to do it. We see that there is a movement in this direction, and we hope this movement is going to continue. Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr. So let's proceed to the results of the study. Mr. Dmytro, as an author of the study, probably you're about to present us the results. Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm about to present 2 studies today. First, best practices of regulation of digital accessibility in Ukraine, and second is the development of assistive technologies for people with disabilities. So the goal of the first study was to provide recommendations to regulate the digital accessibility that they created based on the best practices of the countries of European Union and Great Britain. Among the countries that we studied are Germany and France. Denmark, which is a leader of digital capability in year 2022. They were on the first place according to the index in 2022, and famous leaders in digital accessibility, Great Britain and Sweden. So talking in brief about this conclusions that we found out, the regulations of the developed countries is pretty much similar because it's based on two European directives. First directive 2016-2102 about accessibility of the websites and mobile applications of the government authorities, and another is Directive 2019-882 is the European Act on Accessibility. First directive is already implemented, the regulation is adopted in all of the countries, but it comes into effect starting with in 2025. Let me tell you in brief about the both directive. The first regulates the government authorities as well as the companies who take part in government procurement, government bids, or are otherwise financed by the government. Those requirements are partially implemented in Ukraine according to the resolution of Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine 757 dated 21st July 2023. So this resolution, it relies upon the same European standard that is the standard EN 301549, which is adopted in Ukraine as state standard in Ukraine, but the effect of this resolution only covers the executive authorities and the bodies that submit to it, and it does not contain the mechanism for control and monitoring of compliance with the requirements, and it is not effective for other branches of the government. It's only recommended for local governments. However, this resolution does not regulate the services provided by the private companies. The next directive is European Act on Accessibility. Its effect covers both government authorities and private businesses. So in this case, it doesn't matter what sector this or that body submits to. This directive covers computer hardware systems and software systems, which means both computers, smartphones, tablets, and any other types of equipment, the self-service terminals, the registration desks, information kiosks, ATMs, the machines, the ticket vending machines, so any electronic equipment that users can interact with, telecommunications equipment, telephones, everything related to television equipment, and equipment for multimedia services, as well as book reading devices. So this directive covers the electronic services, the communication services, the television services, multimedia access services, digital solutions for transportation services. For example, when you can buy tickets either on website or in an application or using a terminal, information about the movement of transport in real time, all this information is supposed to be available according to the directive. Banking services for final consumers on top of those provided to the businesses, the electronic book services, as well as electronic commerce services that include any agreements entered into with the help of digital tools. then if we analyze the legislation that we've studied, we can conditionally divide it into three groups. First is the framework legislation about the protection of rights of people with disabilities, non-discrimination of people with disabilities. They usually do not contain clear requirements of accessibility. They just contemplate equal access to everything. Another law is the implementation of the European Directive on Accessibility of Government Websites and Mobile Applications, and another group is the laws that implement the second directive, the European Accessibility Act, that comes into effect in European countries starting with July 2025. Also, during this study, we were able to study relevant institutions that are in charge of control of the digital accessibility. In Great Britain, Denmark and Sweden, the same institutions are responsible for control who are responsible for digital services. In France, it's General Directorate of Social Unity, and in German, they created the Federal Agency on Monitoring of Digital Accessibility that provides consultations and monitors the level of accessibility. And upon the results of this study, we've come up with a number of recommendations. First one is to develop a legislation that includes requirements to transportation services, both for government and private companies that provide transport services, the services of digital communications, the services of audiovisual media such as television and any other multimedia services, banking services, and electronic commerce services. All those services contemplated by the resolution. So basically the idea is to harmonize our legislation with European one, and the range of services may be expanded. We are supposed to implement those requirements for websites, mobile applications, electronic documents, self-service terminals, just as it is stipulated in the directive. It's also recommended to implement those requirements for private businesses, because a lot of services that people with disabilities use, basically all those people that use, they usually use the services by private businesses, and everybody is entitled to the same conditions of use. So those are the same recommendations set forth in their directive. The recommendations as to implementation of requirements. First, we should rely upon the state standard EN 301549. It's already implemented in Ukraine, as well as resolution 757. It already relies upon this standard. We have the standard adopted and we can reference it. Also, we can rely upon the requirements of the directives. Also, the European laws contain the requirement to publish the application on the websites to make sure that the monitoring agencies understand whether the websites are adapted, or they need testing, or they are just not yet adapted, and all those conditions should be implemented in that website. Also, there should be a grace period for the private companies, just in the same way that it's done in European Union, because the effect of the directive starts from the year 25, so they have time to adapt their digital products. Also, the recommendation is to recommend the small businesses to follow those requirements. However, it won't be mandatory. Also, provide the services of the digital content just in the way as it's set forth in the directive. Well, for example, it's difficult in case of mapping services, but the companies then are supposed to provide alternative format of those data. Also, the main recommendation is to appoint the controlling authority which could consult and monitor the compliance with all those requirements in government sector and for private businesses. We recommend the way of Germany, where they created a specific agency for this, which is in charge of monitoring. Well, all the relevant sectors should be controlled by relevant supervisory authorities who already exercise supervision in this area. Also, those government agencies may come up with the reports whether these or those websites comply with the requirements to provide better recommendations. Well, my presentation just disappeared. Can you please hold it for me? Meanwhile, we're having a small pause. We're talking about the European directive, talking about the accessibility measures to create the implementation plan for the directive. Ministry of Economy will be working on this with other parties involved. So yes, we work on implementation of this legislation. Thank you very much for the details. I apologize for the technical pause. So I mentioned the institutional requirements. Now let's continue. Let's proceed to the following survey that talks about the use of the auxiliary technologies for people with disabilities. The task was to analyze the needs of the people with disabilities in the auxiliary technologies and to identify whether those technologies available in the markets and those that they can afford are sufficient for them. The audience contained 307 respondents, 55% men and 45% women. 84% of them are people with the sight impairments and half of them are completely blind. The survey mostly covered the people with sight impairments as a category of people who most widely used auxiliary technologies. People with motoric impairments 10% and people with other impairments up to 5%. The majority of users mentioned the level of knowledge of technologies as average. Also, we had in-depth interviews with 6 experts who were taking part in development of screen readers or speech synthesizers. So the data about the use of technologies, the most widespread device with the screen is an Android-based smartphone, which is pretty predictable. But if we analyze relevant foreign studies, people abroad mostly use iPhone in those cases because it's better accessible. The accessibility functions were implemented there earlier, but in Ukraine, probably due to economic factor, Android phones are more popular, and this statistic is no different from general statistics that we can find in terms of use of Android and iOS. The most popular personal computer is Windows-based system, and the most popular browser is Chrome. It seems obvious, however, abroad, for example, the studies showed that Chrome is not always the most popular because for a long time it didn't have accessibility functions. The most popular auxiliary technology is the reading from screen. The most popular program is NVDA, and the second one is JAWS, and However, in the global market, NVDA and JAWS have pretty equal results. Again, it's mostly related to economic factors because NVDA is free, meanwhile JAWS is a pay-based screen reader. Screen reader is the software that reads from the screen that is used by the people with sight impairments. And well, we got small figures in terms of zoom-in services because the majority of the users were completely blind. Well, during viewing of the website, that there is no strict preference either to use smartphone or computer. The figures are pretty much the same, but talking about some important operations such as banking services or government services, the majority uses smartphone for such services. It's important to be taken into account so that we could create products, first of all, for the mobile devices. It's also worth mentioning that 8% of the users do not perform such operations online, so the traditional way of acquisition of services is still in effect and it's still in demand. So it's important to preserve their services so they could be provided both online and offline. Also, the users mentioned that Microsoft Word is the most suitable format for them. Meanwhile, PDF is on the third place. Sometimes it's incompatible with different screen reading programs and has accessibility problems. It's also important to take into account this factor as well. Only 17% of users assert that the existing technologies are sufficient for them. The most widely used technology is ATMs. Meanwhile, it's not an auxiliary technology. Still, people mentioned it, that this technology is something that they would gladly use. This type of technology, the ATMs with speech synthesizers, are already existing in the world, but they're not yet widely implemented in Ukraine. And those speech synthesizers are unfortunately not so widespread too. The Braille display is the display with a Braille script that is connected to the smartphone or other electronic devices. Unfortunately, those devices are very useful but very costly, and this is why not many people in Ukraine use it. Also, 18% mentioned that they need a paid screen reader. We understand it's a costly software, so this is why it's still in demand. So, conclusions about Ukrainian language synthesizers. First of all, Windows, which is a very popular operating system, doesn't have a built-in Ukrainian speech synthesizer. There are many volunteer software that can be installed, but if people buy a notebook and they pick Ukrainian language and they want to set up the new computer by themselves, they cannot do it because they cannot use the Ukrainian synthesizer, and they have to pick either English or Russian language. So basically, Ukrainian language synthesizer does not exist. The only quality voice is developed by Google TTS. It works on Android-based smartphones. The majority of Ukrainian TTS, the text-to-speech technology that is used by blind people, they are usually developed by the volunteers, and this is why people cannot use them. They resort to searching some illegal websites in search for such technologies, sometimes even Russian websites. And upon the results of this study, we were able to come up with a number of recommendations as follows. First, to review the possibility of compensation for the compensation of the cost of auxiliary technologies. Such type of program operates in a number of countries. We're not talking about full compensation, but compensation of a part of the cost of the technology. It's an issue that still requires more profound study. The second recommendation is improvement of Ukrainian speech synthesizers, and I recommend the following steps. First, cooperation with Microsoft to create a Ukrainian language TTS, because in the majority of European countries they have their voices, but they do not have one for Ukrainian language. Another recommendation is cooperation with Apple about improvement of their Ukrainian voice. In Apple products, Ukrainian voice appeared only 1 year ago. Unfortunately, it's still low quality, and people are forced to use, for example, Russian voices for reading Ukrainian texts or interfaces. It's not so good. However, Ukrainian voice is not good either. Also, we should support the Ukrainian developers of TTS. During our study, we were able to find a number of such projects. However, they don't have support and they develop their products pretty slowly. Also, there is a recommendation on legal regulation of ATM accessibility. The first study was about that. So if we implement the European directives, the requirements in those directives, they will cover the ATMs too. Creation of web page with information about auxiliary technologies. A lot of people lose sight now, unfortunately, and as their relatives or friends try to find some information about auxiliary technologies, they just cannot do it because the information is almost unavailable in Ukrainian language. You should either search in English language websites or Russian websites, which are currently closed in Ukraine, so people usually cannot find or frequently cannot find such information. It's desirable to have some simple page which says where to download screen reader and how to use it. And the following recommendation is the mobile first principle for government digital services. I think it's pretty clear here, but I think we should have mentioned it in recommendation. And the recommendation 6 is to provide alternative for PDF files, because on the government websites the majority of documents, or maybe all of them, are published in PDF format. You can make PDF accessible for the users, however it's not so easy, and frequently people just don't know how to do it, and respectively they do not. So it's better if we could ensure the provision of additional format like Microsoft Doc, not replacing it with Doc, but providing it as alternative format. So this is the recommendation. That's it with my studies. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Dmytro, for your presentation. Well, this survey demonstrated the things that we already knew, that people with sight impairments have difficulties in our country, but there is a will to change it on the legislative level and the level of the society. So my question to you is, in your opinion, when Ukraine can become completely barrier-free in digital sector, and how many times do we need to develop the legislation, to implement it, to take all those steps that government and the businesses should do to remove the barriers completely in digital sector? Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen very quickly. Even in Europe, it's not developing so quickly. Only in year 2016 the directive was adopted regarding the government websites, and for the private companies the requirements come into force only starting with 2025. But we can start developing the legislation because the standards and the directives are already there. We can move faster, but it's gonna take years one way or another, because adopting the legislation is good, adopting the standards is good. However, it's important to make people aware. We're understaffed in terms of specialists, and it's a global problem. I was monitoring it on the global level, and everybody mentioned that web accessibility specialists are rare. So it's not only about the legislation, it's about training of people, of the education of specialists who can implement the digital inclusivity and accessibility. Maybe we have some questions on the floor. Well, now that we do not have any questions on the floor, thank you very much for your survey. Thank you for bringing up this important topic. Let me remind you that we were talking about the ways to improve the level of digital accessibility, and we will be back in air at 1500, and we will talk about the results of the year in the area of nuclear power. Thank you very much.